I'd like to share with you some thoughts about what we just read, focusing in particular on two passages from Lamentations, the last two verses of chapter 4 and the second verse of chapter 1. That means that once you hear me quoting the second verse of chapter 1, it's almost over. At the end of chapter 4, we read, "Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, that dwells in the land of Uz. The cup shall pass over unto you also. You shall become drunk and vomit. The punishment of your iniquity is complete, O daughter of Zion. He will no more exile you. He will visit your iniquity, O daughter of Edom. He will uncover your sins." These verses signify a mystifying enigma. Because what has Edom to do with this story? Jeremiah is writing on the heels of the Babylonian destruction. Ironically, Babylon is mentioned not even once. Edom, which does not anywhere in the story of the destruction appear explicitly, is the sole focus here in these verses. What's going on? In order to solve this riddle, we need to embark upon a historical journey. Now, like most historical journeys, this is going to start out sounding abstract, academic, and probably also irrelevant. However, I guarantee that within another few minutes, you will all see how this story impacts directly, vividly, on every single one of us here, both Jews and Christians. So what's the story with Edom? We start out, of course, with the realization that Edom, descended from Esau, are our cousins. But the familial relationship was a very fraught one. First, on the way to the promised land, we read that Edom denied Israel passage and threatened to go to war against them. Next, we read that Israel returns the favor, as it were, in the time of King David. Second book of Samuel, chapter 8. King David subdues Edom, and Edom becomes a vassal state, a tributary of Israel, and after the split of the kingdom of Judah. And that state of affairs lasts for hundreds of years until in the second book of Kings, chapter 8, Edom rebels under the reign of Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And they set up an autonomous monarchy. They throw off the yoke of Judah. But there is such an ongoing, lingering, implacable resentment. And here I need to supplement the story that we can read explicitly in the Bible with the insights of one of our classic medieval commentators, Rabbi Abraham, son of Ezra. So Rabbi Abraham understands this as a summons to what happens next. Edom is never strong enough to actually threaten Judah, but they can certainly gloat over Judah's downfall. And it's that which we read in these last two verses of chapter 4 of Lamentations. And not only here. In Psalm 137, remember, by the rivers of Babylon. It's about Babylon. And yet, in verse 7, remember, O Lord, against the children of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. And in Obadiah, which is, of course, all entirely addressed to Edom, we read from verse 11, in the day that you did stand aloof, in the day that strangers carried away his substance and foreigners entered into his gates and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even you was as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother, in the day of his disaster. Neither should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither should you have spoken proudly in the day of trouble. You should not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, you should not have gazed on their evil in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither should you have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that escape. Neither should you have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of trouble. And ultimate payback, Isaiah prophesies in chapter 63. Who is this that comes from Edom with crimson garments from Botzrah? This who is splendid in his apparel, stately in the greatness of his power, I that speak with righteousness, mighty to save. And God says, I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the peoples there was no man with me. Yea, I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my fury, and their lifeblood is dashed against my garments, and I have stained all my raiment for the day of vengeance that was in my heart, and my year of redemption are come. So, this is all in the background, this ongoing tension between Judah and Edom. Fast forward, Second Temple period. The enemy and the enmity were never subdued. Edom and Judah continue to be antagonists of one another, and that comes to a head at the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era. Here I need to take a deep breath because this is extremely embarrassing. John Hyrcanus, Hasmonean king of Judah, conquers Edom decisively and subjects Edom to forced conversion. Edom is forcibly converted to Judaism. All the males in Edom are circumcised. And from that moment and on, Edom becomes an integral part of the Jewish people. Now, the payback, on the one hand, was almost immediate. You know, probably the most famous son of post-conversion Edom is someone who figures prominently in both Jewish and Christian traditions. King Herod, in both of our traditions, a murderous tyrant. But this is Edom, part of Judah. And here's where the story gets even more complex and fraught and mysterious, because there is a very old tradition, almost 2,000 years old, that conflates Rome with Edom. As Rabbi Abraham notes, this makes no sense at all. It makes no sense genealogically. It makes no sense historically. Because on the contrary, Edom, as now part of the Jewish people, fought shoulder to shoulder with the Jews in the great revolt against Rome that began in the year 66. What's going on? Whereupon Rabbi Abraham makes a startling statement, perhaps partly conjectural, but definitely grounded in history. And here's where this abstraction starts getting very real and very directly relevant. He proposes it wasn't Rome. It was the Holy Roman Empire. That is, it was the new religion. Says Rabbi Abraham, when Christianity got started, the first Jewish converts came from Edom. That was the core group of Jews that became part of Jewish Christianity. It took me years to ferret out what he was describing. A student of mine helped me, directing me to the story of the Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem, which left Jerusalem shortly before the Great Revolt began, and undoubtedly, by so doing, as the scholars express it, this sealed the tensions that existed between the two communities, and it led to a permanent break, a severance between the Jewish Christians and the rest of the Jewish people. But here's where things get much more relevant to this story. Where did they go? They crossed the Jordan River. They settled in Transjordan in a city called Pella that had a Jewish Christian bishop, apparently for centuries. And it thrived as a Jewish Christian center, which means it was attracting Jewish Christians. Well, which Jews lived in Transjordan? That was Edom. Edom was in southern Transjordan, roughly east of the Dead Sea. So they became part of the new religion. And here's where the gears started turning in my mind. Again, I'm going to repeat this with great shame. There was a singular event in Jewish history when Jews forcibly converted another people. It was Edom. They forcibly converted them to Judaism. And maybe afterward, they may have treated them as second-class citizens because, they were the forcible converts. And Edom seeds a new religion that for the next 2 millennia forcibly converts Jews and treats Jews as second-class citizens. Now, of course, none of this is in the Bible because it's all post-biblical. But there is something that is very explicit in the Bible, and I have to admit this is maybe even more embarrassing than what I already shared with you. After Edom had rebelled against Judah, under the reign of King Amaziah, king of Judah, we read, and this is a story that does not appear in the book of Kings, but it appears in the second book of Chronicles, in chapter 25, beginning in verse 11. Amaziah strengthened himself and led forth his people and went to the valley of Salt and smote the children of Seir, that's Edom, by another name, 10,000. Now, in an era in which all wars were hand-to-hand combat, grievous, shocking casualty counts were not uncommon. But the next verse tells of something entirely different. Again, I need to take a deep breath. And another 10,000 did the children of Judah capture alive, and brought them unto the top of the rock, and cast them down from the top of the rock, that they were all split open. This unspeakable atrocity was perpetrated by Judah against Edom. And to not leave matters to conjecture here, in the Midrash, the rabbis explicitly point to this atrocity as one of the causes of the destruction of Jerusalem. And again, the gears turning. Judah committed this atrocity against Edom. Edom seeds this new faith, Christianity, which perpetrates, you know better than I, countless atrocities against the Jews. Now, I need to make one point explicitly clear here. This is not intended as an exoneration of anybody. If anything, on the contrary, consider what God says to Abraham in the covenant of the halves. In Genesis chapter 15, beginning in verse 13, he said unto Abram, know of a surety that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. In other words, no one gets exonerated by saying, oh, I was part of God's plan. On the contrary, the message is not one of exoneration. We're all guilty. The message, if anything, is more, God has his ledgers. And sooner or later, usually later, but eventually, God always balances his books. And that pertains to every single one of us. And now I need to add on a very personal note. My wife and I, over the course of the many years that we have had the opportunity to have this dialogue with our Christian brothers and sisters, have often experienced what I have to tell you is a very awkward moment when our Christian brothers and sisters come to us to apologize for the crimes that were perpetrated by Christians against Jews. Now, on the one hand, of course, I can't forgive a crime that was perpetrated against someone else, even if he was a co-religionist. On the other hand, this is always very awkward because we don't believe in inherited guilt. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, fathers are not to be put to death for the sons, nor are the sons to be put to death for the fathers. Everyone dies by his own sin. So there is no inherited guilt. So how are we supposed to deal with this? And in chewing over what I just shared with you, I came to maybe a provisional realization. No, there is no such thing as inherited guilt. But there is such a thing as group responsibility, as historical responsibility. If I'm part of a group, then I'm responsible for what that group has done. And what that means is, much as we want to turn that page of history, we are all history's prisoners. How do we get out of the prison? And here's my humble proposition. When we take ownership of history. When we accept upon ourselves that responsibility, something extraordinary happens. And God releases us from prison. And that brings me to the second verse of Lamentations. So it's almost over. The second verse of Lamentations, I have to admit, cannot be translated properly into English. The problem is, it uses a grammatical construction that is unique to biblical Hebrew. It doesn't exist in post-biblical Hebrew either, and it definitely doesn't exist in English. It is a doubling of the verb. In the Hebrew, bachot tivkeh v'layla, which I suppose if we wanted to be literal, we could translate as she weeps weeping in the night. But that doesn't work in English by any means. And again, it doesn't even work in post-biblical Hebrew. What does this doubling of the verb signify? And once again, I feel compelled to share with you the Midrash. The Midrash posits that implied in this construction is she's weeping and someone else is weeping too. Who is that someone else? There are a number of answers proposed, including the ministering angels. But the one that's germane for us is, she is weeping, and the nations of the world are weeping with her. Now, to an undiscerning eye, that would seem extremely perplexing. The nations of the world, but didn't they destroy Jerusalem? One thing you only learn when you build actual human relationships, as opposed to us versus them, is never paint everyone with one brush. There were those who were destroying. There were also those who were gloating, as we already noted. And there were those who were weeping, who appreciated what the temple signified, not just to Israel, but to the world. And they were weeping. But their voice, besides the extraordinarily sensitive hearing of the prophet Jeremiah, went unheard. It's being heard here, now. This is transformative. This is amazing. And this indeed readies us for being able to re-invoke those final words of Lamentations. Return us all, O Lord, and we will return. Renew our days as of old. Amen.